Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Breaking the Spell. It's been quite a while, I know, for our regular listeners or viewers out there. We've been a bit busy in our personal lives, so it's taken us quite a while to get back together. So in any case, today we are actually going to do this episode ourselves. We are going to do a book review. And, this is a book that's quite close to my heart. The book is called No Contest, The Case Against Competition by Alfie Kohn. It's an old book, but all the more like when something's old, but the arguments are still relevant and contemporary, or if I feel the society is heading in the wrong direction, I think we got to revisit the book again, and we got to, just try to see, like what arguments have been made and where we're going wrong, right? So in any case, let me just, for those of you who don't know who Alfie Kohn is, let me just introduce him a little bit. So he's actually like an author of 14 books and hundreds of articles. He writes and speaks widely on human behavior, education, and parenting. And he's well known in particular for his criticisms of competition and rewards. And he's been described in Time magazine. He's American, so he's been described as the country's most outspoken critic of education's fixation on grades and test scores. Some of his other books includes The Homework Myth, Why Our Kids Get Too Much of a Bad Thing, Schooling Beyond Measure, and other unorthodox essays about education, The Myth of the Spoiled Child, Challenging the Conventional Wisdom about Children and Parenting. So you can really tell from these titles, right? Like he's clearly a very unconventional speaker, educator, expert on parenting and education. The book that we're going to review today, No Contest, The Case Against Competition, was actually written in 1986 and with a kind of a new preface in 1992. So that makes it still about almost 30 years ago. On the book, right, you'll find like a very positive blurb by the renowned Noam Chomsky. And he says that, this book is a really impressive piece of work. It's challenging, it's thoughtful, and it reaches to the heart of many problems of our social life and the ideology that constrains and distort it. When I looked at the Amazon page for this book, I saw a 5-star review from someone who described himself as very hyper-competitive. And he said, why is it taking me 25 years for this book to find me? So basically, I'm trying to say that everyone needs to read this book. It's especially catered for people who are competitive. And I do think that although it can be very hard to swallow in terms of what the book is trying to sell, but if you really have an open mind and you care about where society is heading in terms of, the social harms that we have, this book can be really transformative. So, quick summary about the book, right? So essentially, Alfie Kohn is arguing against all the conventional myths that are out there, right? Competition is not an inevitable part of human nature. It does not motivate us to do our best. In fact, he would argue, on the contrary, that the reason why our workplaces and our schools are in trouble is because they value competition instead of excellence. So, rather than build character, competition actually sabotages and ruins our relationships and our self-esteem. He actually says that healthy competition as a phrase is a contradiction in terms. And so, what we need to do is really restructure institutions, right, for the benefit of, ourselves, our children, and our society. So, so if you haven't read the book, right, the book is actually pretty dense. It's full of research findings. He pulls a lot from psychology, sociology, philosophy. So he really goes, to many different areas of research, right, to pull all the different arguments and findings there. And so, what we're going to really try to do today is try to first start with, clarifying the terms, the competition, and trying to make the conversation more constructive and nuanced. Then after which, basically, just like following the book outline, I'm trying to talk about 3 different myths about competition. So the first one is, whether does it promote, excellence, success? The second one, does it promote character building, grit, or some character virtue? Very common topic in contemporary discourse. Does it promote healthy relationships? And kind of the last one, which again, just because everyone argues that it's supposedly innate or natural, we're going to also tackle that question as well, whether it is. And of course, I'm going to invite my 2 co-hosts here to, react to the arguments of the book and, the implications from it. The last part, basically, obviously, the question will be, okay, well, if we don't have competition, what's the alternative? So we're going to talk a little bit about cooperation. So as I said earlier, Alfie is really like primarily an educator, a teacher. So quite seriously, most of the examples that he draws on is usually from schools and classrooms, right? And it's going to be a much bigger topic if you're going to talk about society at large or economies and the global system. So please don't put that responsibility on us to kind of deliver alternatives on that. But I guess we can initiate some conversation on this. Our thoughts on it. The other thing that I'd like to draw people's attention to is that you can really see in popular culture, right? Like you got reality-based TV shows like The Apprentice, Survivor, or even fictional ones like Squid Game, right? This shows draw a lot on that, on our fascination with competition. And I think we really need to examine this kind of tropes and this kind of narratives out there. And of course, in Singapore, it has to be said, right? We have this thing called a kiasu mindset or kiasu culture. And for someone who's not Singaporean, that basically means, I had to look it up actually, how do you define this? Which really means a grasping, selfish attitude that arises from fear of missing out. So very apt words to describe what, in our local parlance, kiasu culture is. Okay, so just give me 5 minutes, right, to just go through some clarification of terms. Then I'm going to ask Unsu and Santosh to kind of jump in and give me your thoughts about competition. So the first thing to make very clear, because already you hear this word competition, some people may be very confused. You may be thinking that Alfie is talking about conflict or, just struggles in life. And Alfie makes it very clear, this is not what he means. When we talk about competition, right, we actually mean a very specific thing, a specific thing. And what he coins as a term is this acronym called MEGA, which means mutually exclusive goal attainment. So competition essentially is about, like, if, let's say, Onsu and I in a contest, we want to get the first prize, right? Well, there's only one outcome. Either I win or he wins, right? No, there's no possibility of us winning the same first prize, right? So this is a very constructed artificial situation. Obviously, in nature or just living in as a human being, in society, of course, there's conflict. And Alfie welcomes that. He doesn't deny that conflict is, in some sense, essential. But where he draws the line is when we construct an artificial situation where one person has to win at the expense of the other. And of course, you can, look at that in other layers, right? So not just, individuals, so there's obviously schools, there's classrooms, there's politics, right? Companies. And so we're now living in this society where everyone's competing against one another for one particular prize. So, like I said just now, Alfie basically makes the point that competition, in his in his argument, is the worst way to achieve success, build relationships, partnerships. It definitely has a detrimental effect on your psychological well-being. But he knows that, like, out there right now, there's kind of like two positions people hold when it comes to competition. So the first one is called unqualified endorsement. So these are like the camp of people who believe like winning is the only thing, or it's a dog-eat-dog world out there, right? And the most important thing that we should do as a society is to prime our kids, train them, and educate them to be as prepared for competition as early as possible. So that's kind of like position number one. Position number two is kind of where people who are more liberal-minded tend to find themselves in, which is qualified endorsement, right? So it's not that competition is bad, it's just that competition has gone too far, right? Whether it's in America or whether it's in other countries like us, right? The problem actually is that we just push our kids too fast, too hard to be number one. But if we keep things in perspective, right, the competition or the fact that we have competition is actually natural, it's appropriate, and it can be healthy. So that is position number two. And Alfie talks about how this used to be his position as well. So after going through what he says, 400 studies, he now occupies a third camp. And let's see whether we are going to be in that camp as well, which is that competition is not only destructive or counterproductive in its excess, but it's really destructive in nature. So like I said just now, he thinks that the phrase, healthy competition is a contradiction. The ideal amount of competition, in his words, is none, right? And so, like I said just now, don't confuse that with conflict. That's not what he's saying. He's just saying that, the best we can do is actually reduce competition or eliminate it altogether. And he talked about like how people used to find this argument really hard to swallow, right? Because it sounds really radical. How can we have no competition at all? And so he kind of put out a, kind of an argument to address this, which is, just because something is bad in excess, it doesn't mean it's good in moderation or even in small amounts. So obviously you can think of examples like bullying, sexual assault, torture, murder. I mean, some of these things are just inherently destructive, and of course we can't avoid it existing somehow in society, and it exists for all sorts of reasons. But what he says is that based on our intuitions, based on our research, based on our values and beliefs, really the position we should be taking is to have none of these at all. One last point to just draw out, and then this will actually help to enrich our discussion when I ask the two of you about it. So he also says that we can look at competition in two ways. One is structural. So structural means, right, like I said just now, like if me and Unsu are in a contest, right, the way the rules are set up is that only one of us would win, right? And so he calls this the I succeed only if you fail. But there's a stronger version, which is I will succeed only if I make you fail. And so the first instance is something like golf or bowling, where if me and Unsu go bowling, I can't trip him, I can't push him, I can't do those things to him, right? But nevertheless, he has to have a lower score than I do, right, to win, so that I can win. A stronger version of this is like war, basketball, and tennis, where you do have to actively interfere with someone in order to win the game. And he clarifies, obviously, that just because someone plays basketball or tennis, it doesn't mean that person is nasty, neurotic, or malicious. But the problem is just the setup, right? It's the structure that creates this, undesirable effects that we're going to talk about. Then the second important clarification is that, or the second dimension, I should say, about competition is that it can be intentional. So right now, there's three of us, hosting this session. And, if one of us wants to be very competitive, say Onsu wants to be the smartest, the funniest, right? He can, just try to be there, right? He can try to win the two of us in trying to attain that. There's no trophy, and, maybe Onsu can be the funniest and I can be the stupidest or whatever. But the idea here is that, competition can be intentional. And so the important thing Alfie wants to talk about is that, you can have one or the other. So there are situations where there's a structural competition, but people are not intentionally trying to compete. You can also have situations where you're intentionally trying to compete, but there's no structure there. There's nothing for you to win. So in any case, the takeaway message here really for Alfie is that what we need to understand from this is that, success and victory are two completely different ideas. And what's problematic right now in society is that we confuse the two. That we think that in order to be, say, the funniest person, say, I have to win Onsu and Santosh in humor, right? So that's the confusion that we have. Okay, so there's some terms just to clarify where we are. So I thought as an opening question for both of you, I would ask whether you guys have ever been competitive, which I highly doubt so, but I'm just going to ask. And what are your current feelings about the centrality of competition right now in our lives?
Yeah, I am competing to be the first to speak. I think I have been competitive in my past, and I think there's still a part of me that is competitive. I mean, the most recent example I can think of is when for a period of time, I really got into playing chess online.
Oh.
And I think chess is a perfect example of a structurally competitive game. And, the type where you are actually doing things to try and make the other opponent lose. So, it's direct competition. And I think I stopped after a while because I actually realized I didn't feel very good after, there's always going to be, you may feel good when you win, but it also, for some reason, it just feels, it sucks to lose, and I would get frustrated because, I would just try and spend more time trying to improve, and it just seemed I wouldn't improve. And I just found myself naturally gravitating towards other activities that seem more cooperative or collaborative, that exercise the collaborative muscles. Yeah.
Yeah, for me, I think it's context specific. There are environments which are prime for competition, and I naturally became competitive in those environments, and the feeling was I felt very bad in those environments. And so over time, I gravitated away from environments that were competitive in nature to those that were more healthy and cooperative in nature. Yeah, and what I mean, I've learned that competitive environments actually had a bad effect on my mental health, a very, very bad. It took its toll on my mental health. Yeah, and so from then onwards, just to preserve my mental health, I avoided competitive environments. Work environments are one. And so there were times where like I was trying to cooperate, right? But you're then being taken on a ride, and then people, yeah, they just like they take advantage of you and all. And but you think, oh, it's all in good faith, and yeah, but after a while, like, yeah, the spirit gets we get dispirited after a while, and it's not healthy to be in those environments. Yeah, so I wish I learned how to have my antennas tuned into environments that sapped my energy versus those that actually added to my energy and my mental health. Yeah.
Yeah, so what I'm hearing from the both of you is right, like you so if someone is sitting among us right now and is a supporter of, say, competition, that person would say to the two of you, well, that's because the two of you are losers. That's why you don't like competition. And Alfie Kohn actually talks about that as well, that when he was on a very famous talk show, and this was when the book came out and made a splash, right? He was asked by this very famous talk show host, Phil Donahue, just on live television, is the reasons why you are against competition is because you've been losing in your life, and he asked us to invite us to think, how you're going to respond that, on live television. So, to me, I think personal experiences are very important because everything you guys described just now were dovetail very well with what I'm going to share later about the effects of competition on psychological well-being or relationships between people. And that's not just, Alfie also makes it very clear, it's not just effects on losers, but even effects on winners. And I would have some examples to also draw on when it comes to that as well. So I think on the one hand, right, like anecdotally, these personal experiences are very important. They tell us a lot about, do people actively seek to be in competitive situations? What do they feel after they've been in one? Do they like it? Do they stay in it? And I think along with that, you got all the other empirical research that shows, and history actually, I should say, that shows that, things don't have to be this way. And that's where we're going to try to go into today. I'll share my own personal experiences later. So instead, what I'm going to do right now is just start going down through, the presentation.
Yeah. Douglas, just to actually, I like being a loser. It's like the best thing ever. It's a huge load off our shoulders, and we can be so light and so playful and so it's freeing. Being a loser is so freeing. It's amazing.
Thanks for bringing that in, Santosh. It reminds me of like a couple of years ago, we were trying to organize like a failure festival.
Yeah.
Oh, really?
Festival.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, it's so freeing, man. It's amazing. Yeah, I wish you could just have a like a movement around failures and losing.
Right.
Yeah.
So actually, now that you say that, right? Actually, let me just talk about this a little bit before we go on. I do feel somehow you can find it like little pockets, right? Like in society right now, like you said, movements, right? Where people are trying to say, okay, if you didn't get top in class, if you didn't get, to a good school, you can still succeed and make it in life. And especially in Singapore, I remember there was one movement in particular called Beyond Grades. It was like hashtag Beyond Grades or something like that. And you had all these actually celebrities. So I'm thinking of like DJs and artists who say that, they'll hold up a signboard and they say, okay, this is my score when I was in, I think, PSLE or O levels. And, look at where I am right now. I've made it in life, right? Despite maybe having a poor or mediocre score in schooling. And I mean, there's something quite noble about it. I respect it a lot. But at the same time, I feel like the message still isn't completely unvarnished. It still reeks a little bit about competition, and that you know, like if you want to consider you made it in life, you got to be a celebrity of some sort, or you got to show that you produce some award-winning, you know, radio program, TV show, or whatever. And I think, you know, the message needs to be even deeper than that. And so going back to what you said, Santosh, about how we need something that celebrates losers. Yeah, I think it's more than just that. Like, you got to celebrate the idea that everyone's kind of equal, no matter how much they made it in life. Yeah, something like that. Well, at least that's my thoughts. Okay, maybe let me just go on to the first myth. I'll just skim through it first. So, look, I'm not going to go through all the amount of research studies that he has, because this is way too much. So essentially, I'm just going to read out the conclusion. So what Alfie tells us, right, is that not only is competition not required for excellence, but its absence is required. And he actually talks about how all these studies are actually, you know, available, but they're just not being discussed in, you know, the public arena or popular publications. Instead, what's really happening is that we're brought up to compete frantically and to believe in it. And that really we've all been deluded about that. So he talks about how there are like studies, you know, done in classrooms and even among adults. And what they find is that, because generally what happens is that in these studies, they try to set up a control experiment, right? Where one group is doing something that's competitive, another group is doing something which is cooperative. And I'll talk about a very specific study later, because that one's quite fascinating. And what they always generally tend to find is that the cooperative group will always beat up the competitive group. And that's scored on things like originality, you know, creativity, and even just solving puzzles. So in any case, right, he then tells us, you know, like, incidentally, these studies are done so widely that they are the same conclusion turns up in whether it's urban settings, rural settings, and different cultures. So in any case, he kind of gives us 3 reasons why, you know, the absence of competition is even better, you know, in terms of trying to attain excellence or productivity. One is that competition causes anxiety. So when you try to beat someone, you know, you're being distracted from doing the best job that you can, because all you're focusing on is trying to beat the other person. The second thing is that cooperation allows people to share their skills, talents, and resources, right? And he talks about how, like, you know, one of the ways that competition is, as a concept, supported in society, right, especially in American culture, is that imagine when America was competing against Russia to, in terms of the race to the moon. And, you know, he says, you know, why is it assumed that competition would have been the best way to bring the first man to the moon? Wouldn't it have been better if Americans had cooperated with the Russians? You know, then you don't need to have redundant problem solving on both sides, because you could share your resources. And the other important thing about this scenario that he's talking about also is that due to competition, we don't even ask basic questions about why is it even a goal? Why do we need to rush to go to the moon? You know, so why he says that competition is so obscures our vision, because we don't even ask the basic questions about, is this even good to begin with? One example I can think of right now is obviously we are, you know, still living on the tail end of the pandemic, and you know, in the height of the pandemic, there was this vaccine inequality globally. So poor countries basically have, you know, little access to the vaccines, and the reason for that is obviously due to the ethos of competition, because they didn't want to allow these countries to, you know, have access, right, to the resources that helped, you know, our societies to recuperate from the pandemic. Then obviously the other more simple but yet subtle reason why, you know, competition and success is on opposite ends is because it's opposite directions. There's this very famous, not famous, I shouldn't say that. There's this very consistent finding in psychology and sociological research, which is when people are focused on externalities, meaning that rewards. So think of like grades and you know, trophy prizes. The less they are concerned with the intrinsic motivation of completing a task. So one example that Alfie talks about is, and it's quite colorful, it's quite funny, is that, you know, when you're in the classroom, right, there's always this student who's always putting up their hands, and it's like, you know, call on me, right? And the teacher calls on her, and then she asks, what's the question again? So, you know, Alfie is talking about like showing like how, you know, when you see examples like this, you know, what you can see is that the individual is not really concerned with the subject matter, but she's just concerned with being number one or answering the question first. Yeah. So Yeah, so basically that's the first one. That this is the one that I think for most people is hard to grapple with, because we're so conditioned to believe that, to not for us to say do well in our jobs or to do well in school, we got to believe we need competition, like we got to feel that we got to get the A grade or something like that. But if we actually turn it all around, we may not actually need this, and there's definitely ways that people can actually do better, be better learners, be better students, be better product. Well, I don't want to say that be more productive. This is something I'm trying to stay away from. But yeah, but they can be just basically better in the crowds, right? If there wasn't for the spectrum of competition. So anyway, I want to ask you guys, right? So this is the first myth, which is, have you ever been in a situation where a person of authority has maybe argued to you that competition is essential to promoting, productivity and success? And, maybe even before hearing me talk about it, do you think competition is actually important in that sense? Yeah. And I'm thinking even also for you guys to answer this question, to also draw from your personal examples and through history as well, right? Do the great scientists of the past needed competition in order to become who they are today? Anyone?
Santosh, you go first.
Yeah.
Okay, so I disagree with the premise that competition is essential for productivity. Margaret Heffernan, she gave a TED talk, a very popular TED talk on the super chicken theory. So basically, she had one group of average egg-laying chickens and another group of very high-performing egg-laying chickens. All right. So the eggs that the average chickens laid were smaller in size as compared to the eggs that were laid by the high-performing chickens. And I think this, Duke University, and they put the chickens in a cage. And after a few weeks, they went to see what happened. Overall, the average chickens, they thrived. They were fatter, they looked better, and the eggs were still being laid. Whereas in the other cage, only 3 chickens were left. The 3 highest performing chickens had pecked to death all the other chickens. Yeah. So, I mean, this was illustrative of what happens in a lot of organizations, right? Where to go to the top, you push down and you stamp on the shoulders of other people below you, right? So that's like, a classic story about productivity, competition leading to productivity, right? Google, through 2 studies, which were formally published, Project Aristotle and Project Oxygen, they went on to understand what constitutes a high-performing team or a highly productive team. And they realized the highest performing teams were not teams that were made up of high-performing individuals. You would imagine that if you took, like, Real Madrid, like all the high-performing soccer players and most of the expensive soccer players, and put them in a team. They did win. The Real Madrid did win the Champions League this year, but apart from that, Google did this study. The teams with great individuals didn't do well. Instead, the one variable that they found was key was psychological safety to high-performing teams. And they then distilled this quantitatively. Can you measure this? Because you want to prove this quantitatively, right? It has to be Google, a study by Google. And so the first metric was equality in distribution of conversation turn-taking. Yeah, so there was no one person trying to dominate the conversation over the others. And second one was social sensitivity, the ability to look at all your other team members in the conversation to see if they're tuning in or they're tuning out, and to, like, ask them, hey, are you doing okay? Like, is there something we can help you with? Yeah, so to be able to watch out for everyone, that was the second quality. Yeah, so I mean, those are like factual studies, right, made by Google. In the book itself, by Alfie Kohn, myth number 2, competition keeps productivity high. There was a study by David and Roger Johnson. They were brothers who were educators at the University of Minnesota. They analyzed 122 studies of classroom achievement conducted from 1924 to 1980. 65 found that cooperation promotes higher achievement than competition. 8 found the reverse. and 36 found no significant difference. Yeah. So, I mean, there are studies after studies. I think the book has got one more study, but I won't elaborate on that. So, like, very quickly, those are my points of view with regards to productivity.
Sorry, can you remind me the myth we're talking about now? It's about competition leads to greater productivity. Or can you summarize again? What is the myth?
Yeah, basically the idea is that, you know, it's due to competition that people will be more productive, or they'll be more successful, or they achieve, you know, excellence. So it can be excellence in the craft, or it can be excellence in, in their work. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think what that myth is capturing on an intuitive level is just this idea of carrots and sticks, I think. So I think we have this general notion that to motivate people, you either need some kind of reward or some kind of punishment or pain. And I think competition really tries to tap into both those things. So if you're the winner, you get certain rewards, and then it's really painful to be a loser. So, you know, it's really trying to combine both those motivating factors. And you know, I think that is a basic assumption that we all grow up with. It's pretty innate. And I believe in Alfie Kohn's book, he begins by saying it's like, these ideas are like the water we swim in. So it's so ever pervasive that we don't even notice it. And it takes a lot of effort to really question whether carrots and sticks really are the best way to get other people to do what we want them to do, or even to get ourselves to do what we want to do. You know, I do agree with this idea of safety that Santosh brought up. I think it's such a underestimated quality to have for like learning. And like, you know, it's the type of practice that I've been adopting. I think you guys have heard me talk about this before. It's Feldenkrais. You know, it's like a physical movement. I mean, it's like yoga or Pilates, but where Feldenkrais really distinguishes itself from all the others is like you're really moving so slowly. Sometimes like the exercises aren't even about moving, you're imagining moving. And the whole idea is that when the body feels completely safe, that's where you can really optimize for learning. And Feldenkrais, the guy who developed it, I mean, he's like a philosopher of consciousness. You know, how do you transform your consciousness? So yeah, I think safety is something that contributes more to probably learning and effectiveness than competition. And I think at the end of the day too, it also depends on what you want to optimize for. So if, yes, you want to optimize for like the fastest runner or the most performing individual, then competition might be the best tool to use for that very specific case. But I think in order for us as humans and societies to thrive, we need to optimize for a much wider variety of things, you know, highly functioning groups or teams of people or entire societies, our entire civilization. We need to optimize for how we can collaborate with nature and not compete with nature. So yeah, for a lot of these things, I think competition is like this. It's a very simple, primitive tool. And I think the key thing is just to be very intentional about it. Like, you know, we can actually use competition perhaps. And maybe this is where I might differ from Alfie Kohn, or because I think I heard you saying that Alfie Kohn came to believe that there's no good use for competition whatsoever. Like, you know, it's just a bad thing in even small amounts. I'm not sure. I'll have to listen more to the arguments about it. But I think that if you are intentional about it, then you can choose when you want to be competitive or when you want to use competition. And I suspect that once you take this intentional approach, in the vast majority of cases, you end up deciding, okay, competition is not the approach we want to take in this case.
Okay, very cool. So there's a couple of points here to address. So I'll just say very quickly, yes, I agree a lot with what Santosh also shared about how psychological safety probably is one of those very important factors that would help to explain, a person performing quite well, and knowing that that perhaps, for example, that they may not lose their income or lose their life savings or something like that. Like, they can feel competent and safe doing something, right? Like whether it's at a job. And I think with what you just said, Onsu, about, yes, can we be intentional about instances that we will apply competition? I think that's definitely possible. I think in terms of what Alfie would say is that we really got to be mature and wise about when we're going to apply this. I know that he definitely talks about it when it comes to grades. Like, he thinks very young children should not be graded in the school system, and there should be some kind of age appropriateness about when to use it. Then I also want to talk a bit about like our feelings, right, about competition, and then this based on what you said, Onsu. So I myself have not competed per se, like I've been in martial arts, and I haven't like formally competed in that sense, but I've been around people who have competed, and even for, say, just the three of us, right? So maybe when you're in school, just before the exam, maybe you burn the midnight oil, right? Like, you're just frantically studying the last 24 hours or last week before an exam, and you can feel like, okay, shit, I got to get a good grade. So I think there's a very potent instances where we do feel the effects of competition, and you do feel this rush and burst of energy and motivation to do something. And I think that's where a lot of people over attribute competition to, like, the positive benefits of it. Because if you think about it, right, like, even after you study really hard for the exam, once the exam is over, you almost forget everything. And that points back to, your intrinsic motivation. Did you really care a lot about the subject you were studying? Like for me, when I was in Polytechnic, I didn't like advertising. Of course, the presence of competition means that I better study real hard just to get a good grade. But honestly, I didn't enjoy the subject. I didn't think very much about it. And, in that sense, you can imagine a lot of instances where people are like that. Like, they are just compelled by the competitive setting to do something. And that feels like as if that's a good thing to have in society. The other thing that I also wanted to talk about also, because this just came up very recently, so it's a good example to bring up. So in tennis, there's this very famous player, Nadal. So he's just won. I'm not a tennis player, but I've been told by many of my tennis friends, okay, he just achieved something very remarkable. He's won this whole series of tennis competition. So this is an extreme example of someone who has, beaten the odds. And when I hear this narrative from my friends, I understand what they're talking about. That, this is a player who's significantly older. He has some serious medical issues that would affect his performance. He's, facing much younger opponents. So in that competitive setting, right, like, it does make his achievement look more grand, right, more beautiful. But of course, like, the question that can be asked is that, well, sure, maybe in a game like tennis, where it is a competitive setting, it does make the success look more salient and socially meaningful. But sport doesn't have any serious social implications. But when you look at something like the economy, politics, or schools, there's something more seriously at stake here. And I think, even when you look at Nadal, even
You're talking about Nadal, is it?
Nadal, sorry, Nadal,
the Spanish player.
Yeah. If he was like in a setting where it's not competitive, you could still, like, let's say he didn't win, okay, that's basically, just put it this way, even if he didn't win, but if he did really well, I mean, people can still, value that, cherish that, talk about it. So I don't think he has to win per se for us to recognize, right, to acknowledge that he's still an excellent tennis player. So yeah.
I have to say, I mean, Nadal is a pretty incredible player to follow. Like, I don't really follow tennis that much myself, but the few times I have, I've just always been impressed how he pushes himself beyond like that extra limit that so that is impressive. But since you brought up tennis, like, an example that I wanted to bring to this conversation was I just came across this story a couple of days ago, but last year in the French Open, there's a female player named Naomi Osaka. She's a Japanese tennis player, And she declined to do any press conferences for the French Open. And she said because to take care of her mental health, she had she noticed that the press conferences were having a negative effect. And then the French Open organization decided to fine her 15,000 because it was not fulfilling her obligations. And in the end, she decided to withdraw from the competition. And a lot of famous tennis players actually came out in support of her. And yeah, I think that's such a powerful example of someone modeling how some things in life are just more important than winning a competition, like taking care of your mental health.
Yeah, that's a good example. Yeah, that's a good one. And this comes from, one of the best athletes out there. Yeah, Santosh.
It goes back to Unsu's earlier point of local optima versus global optima. So what if Rafael Nadal has won all the Grand Slams? I mean, there's this emptiness after winning it all. So what? What if we could have directed all of that energy to solving climate change, environmental issues, or social issues? The amount of attention, okay, I'm not disputing the effort and the energy and the sacrifices made and the people he's inspired along the way, but I'm just trying to think of it from another point of view, right? Energy flows where attention flows. What if we channel all that attention and the energy to solving issues that are more grave and more important and urgent in our times today? See, so I feel it's just, yeah, so you have got local optimism all over these places, but globally, society and how it's crumbling with our climate and environmental crisis and our social crisis is just a shame that, yeah, we just have pockets of brilliance here, but we've not fully harnessed and channeled the full energy and potential of our human civilization and race. And the way I look at it, right, is from the point of view of acupuncture. Yeah, and the reason why I believe in breaking the spell, right, what we're trying to do here is in acupuncture, you have a lot of energy or qi that is flowing in one channel or a few channels. And the other channels of the body, they are devoid of qi. And in acupuncture, you try to direct that flow. Yeah, and so what we're doing here, right, is by breaking the spell of competition, you allow energy to disperse in a much healthier way through the entire system, so the system heals. Yeah, so this is what I hope we can do with this conversation and breaking the spell. Yeah, which is a kind of an acupuncture of sorts on this whole global system or global optima.
I do want to bring in this idea that there may be a psychological or developmental need to have inspiring figures like Rafael Nadal. There's this educational philosopher, something Egan, that he's Canadian, and I've read one of his books, and he talks about how for kids they go through this developmental cycle where in the beginning they learn through myths, right? Through start binaries like dark, light, good, evil, and to mark out the extremes. And then as they get older, they learn through finer and finer distinctions. And then there's a second stage after that where they learn through extreme examples. So, this is where kids get really into the Guinness Book of World Records. Who is the fastest? What is the biggest, right? And it seems to be a necessary developmental stage. And, in human history, we have myths about gods and heroes. And so I am wondering if, there's something psychologically important for us to have these things and that we can't ignore it. So if you suppress it or if you try and ignore it, it will somehow come back in another way. So I don't know what to do with that, but I'm just saying that, I don't know, it's something that I'm thinking of.
It's a great question for discussion. I feel then where do people like Mickey Cashtan or Charles Eisenstein or all of this like amazing luminaries, right? Who are great thinkers and philosophers who know the solutions, like Kate Raworth, and like where do they figure in this developmental cycle of kids? Is it after the kids are after the effects of the hero complex has worn off the kids, then they start to look for this like more boring types of folks as inspirational figures? Because Charles Eisenstein is not really very popular. It's not like an icon, right? Like for kids and for like majority of members of the public. But for me, he's like as good as Rafael Nadal or like any other rock star.
Yeah.
Or pop cultural icon like Marilyn Monroe or whoever. Yeah. Like how do we push these people up? Yeah.
Well, okay, so let me explain a little bit more. Like I remember his name now, Kieran Egan, and he wrote this book called.
Just a quick note, right? We actually have his son on our show, David Egan. That's his son.
Oh wait, that was his son?
Yes.
Whoa, I never made that connection. That's crazy.
Yeah. So what a small world.
Wow. Okay, this is blowing my mind now.
Yeah.
I have to reach out to him now because I really like this book that his dad wrote called The Educated Mind. So, you know, then there's a next phase of development called the romantic phase, where I think it's more about like emotions, strong emotions, heroism. But then the stage after that is then the philosophical stage, where it's about rationality, science, using science to understand the world. But then the last stage is the ironic stage of understanding, where you begin to question your own culture. And, you know, that is the last and final stage. So I think that's where, you know, these people that you're mentioning, like Charles Eisenstein, Mickey Cashton, you know, that's where they come in the ironic stage, because they are very powerful commentators and critics of our current culture.
Fascinating.
Okay, I would love to jump in, but I feel like I got to go on. So let me move on. Keep those thoughts in mind. We'll see whether we readdress it again later. So anyway, I'll go on to the second myth. Okay, and this one actually, you can kind of like take a page from just looking around you, right? When you go to say a bookstore, right, you see lots of books on, you know, raising your child to be resilient, to have grit, you know, to build character. So, you know, in a lot of these books, sometimes it's implied that competition is the thing that is required, right, to help our children to develop these things. So, simply put, actually, I feel that we did cover this a little bit already with our personal sharings, our personal stories. But really, competition doesn't do that, because what Alfie does in the book is that he looks at a couple of constructs, but the one he pays a lot of attention to is self-esteem. And basically, he says the evidence here is very crystal clear, which is, and we're just putting in his words, competition is to self-esteem as sugar is to teeth. In any competitive encounter, losing is always possible, and that feels lousy. But even when you win, you gloat for a while, you soar, but you will come down, you crash, and you need more of it. So it's like tolerance to a drug, or, you know, essentially like the hedonic treadmill. And he even likens it to like drinking salt water when you're thirsty. So what he says is that the solution is the problem. And
you just went on mute.
How competition actually escalates, you know, our emotional dysfunctions. And he says, you know, the mentality that a competitive person has is that I'm only as good as I am based on how much, you know, I can beat these people or I can win these activities. And, you know, what you find in the literature is that when you compare, say, someone who's very competitive versus someone who's very cooperative, it's actually the cooperative people who are more, they have a more internal sense of themselves and self-control. They don't feel bad if they were to lose. And, you know, they actually have a strong sense of actually individualism, which is supposed to be the thing that competition is supposed to promote, right? Instead, what Alfie argues is that competition promotes dependence, or that you require other people around you because your self-evaluation is dependent on them. And so, you know, in that sense, he's saying that really, you know, we need to decouple this myth that, you know, to promote strong individualism or whatever the heck this is supposed to be, you need competition. I have a friend that actually really comes in really well with this story. So basically, I have this friend who used to be very competitive. He was always someone who needed to see how many people he could beat in the office. He had relationships that were based on beating other people so that he could win the girl. And I could see it had a very destructive effect on his psychological well-being. And only when he came out of it, thankfully, which he has, could I see, like, he has a healthier sense of himself, right? So, I mean, this is just one example that I could draw on. I'm just going to go through this other myth as well. So I'm going to go through these two myths because I think it anyway goes quite well together. So the third thing that he also talks about, Alfie, is that, competition doesn't build good relationships. It seems pretty obvious, but we have to say it. It poisons our relationships with others because we become envious of winners, we are contemptuous of losers, and in popular culture, right, what's a very nasty epithet? Loser, right? What he finds, in the literature is that when people are put in competitive settings, right? So some people may not be competitive intrinsically speaking, right? But once they're placed in a setting, these things happen. Like they communicate less effectively, they become less trusting, less sensitive, less able to take other people's perspectives. And Alfie asks, like some people ask the question, Alfie says that, some people ask the question, does competition promote aggression? And he says, competition is aggression. So it's even like a pointless question. The question is just whether does it manifest in outright violence, and maybe it doesn't do that because maybe if you're in a sanctioned setting. So one good example, especially in America, is spelling bees. When in a setting like that, you can't obviously beat up your opponent, but nevertheless there is a certain subtle sense of violence and aggression and aggressiveness. So Alfie invites us to think about like how we unconsciously invite this in everyday instances. For example, if you're going to try to get your kids to bed, if you say things like, "Oh, who can get into their pajamas the fastest," or even in a friendly game, you try to keep score. You should watch out for these instances because it can reinforce the setting that we are all against each other. And so, in any case, he then draws from this to say that, look, if you really want to build good relationships with each other, we need to make good structural changes, right? In terms of reducing competition. And I like this point that he brings up that, of course, even if you buy into this message that competition is not good, and you try to work on yourself to be less competitive, to him, it's, quite vapid. It's really, really hard to do that. It's not that it isn't worth doing, but the point here is that we really need to look at more structural, more social settings, right? Because the problem with an ethos of what the ethos competition does to us is that we then come up with this narrative, right? That if someone is not winning in life, it means that this person is intrinsically, lazy, entitled, privileged, or evil. If your kids are not learning in school, they just need to be punished more because it's all about like, the carrot and stick mentality that Unsu brought up. So the idea here is that like, if you really, really want to look at people more holistically and, you really want to help them better themselves, right? In any sense, right? In any domain, then we really need to try to get rid of as much competitive settings as possible. So anyway, my question to you guys is, think of it this way, right? Like, I think everything I said just now would sound very contrarian, and probably like if we have someone right now in this room with us listening to us talk, right? Think of a parent who's maybe trying to ask their child to compete in a contest, right? And such a parent will probably tell us, right? Look, losing is part of life. You just got to learn how to get good at it. So even if you don't win, the most important thing here is to learn discipline and to learn grit. So what I want to ask you guys is, what do you make of such arguments? And do you think everything I said just now would really like change people's minds?
I think it's an important response to acknowledge and not dismiss. I mean, I think the reality is that the majority of human beings live in a very ultra competitive world, and that in order to survive this system, you do kind of have to be competitive. It's like a chicken and egg thing. We're not going to be able to create alternative systems until we can actually step away from the system. But, you know, like for a lot of people who take that pioneering approach to step away, it could be very costly to them. I mean, you know, I think if you look at parents who don't want to put their kids in the competitive school system and homeschool them instead, there's a lot of risks involved there, you know, like whether or not they'll be able to get good jobs, you know, at a later point, whether they'll be, you know, well socialized to adapt to a competitive world. And I think it's really difficult. I think, you know, our social systems depend on a certain kind of story that we've been telling about what human beings are. And that story, you know, the systems create the story and the story creates the systems as well. So it's just this continuous loop. And I'd say like underneath competition is a more fundamental story about individualism, that we are individuals, you know, and I would call this toxic individualism, this idea. And, you know, I think from a big picture view, we can begin hacking away at it through, like, let's say, through greater scientific understanding. I mean, we now know that, I don't know, more than 90% of the DNA in our bodies is non-human. So if someone beats me in a competition, it's like, who's winning? I'll be like, oh, well done. The 90% of non-human DNA in you has just beat me at this whatever, you know, like, and so the more we can have that kind of understanding, the more we can sort of break the spell of toxic individualism, which leads to competition. I think it's really hard to give any kind of advice to individual people who are trying to figure out how they can step out. I think we just have to keep these dialogues happening, and it has to be, we have to find very simple practices that everyone can do each day to exercise different muscles. So right now our muscles are geared towards competition, and just every day we got to find opportunities to be collaborative, to be cooperative, and that will slowly help us kind of build the capacity to step away from this competitive system.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I'll be able to agree more with what Unsu said. On one hand, you have a system that's based on scarcity, separation, and helplessness or powerlessness. I think Miki Keshtan talked about it. And that's based on this toxic individualism, or the idea of the skin encapsulated body, right? That I'm separate from everyone else. Yeah, but on the other hand, we have like another model or version or story to tell. Yeah, I love what Unsu said, right? Stories reinforce the systems, and then systems reinforce the story. And the alternative stories are around abundance, around connectedness, and around choice. Yeah, I think like those are the kinds of stories we can tell, and the way to do that is through experiential understanding of this shared connection that we all have of one another, that we are probably not like skin encapsulated bodies, we are like souls with a limited human existence, for example. Yeah, so there's just alternative stories to tell to get people out of their bodies, and this sense of scarce individualism. I think I want to just draw some references from the book. Yeah, because I might sound a bit like, you know, like spiritual with all of these references, right? So let's get to parts of the book that resonated with me. So this is what Alfie Kohn wrote about the myth that competition is inevitable. So we in the United States assume that our desperate quest to triumph over others is universal. But half a century ago, Margaret Mead and her colleagues found that competition was virtually unknown to the Zuni and the Iroquois in North America, and to the Batonga of South Africa. Since then, cross-cultural observers have confirmed that our society is the exception rather than the rule. From the Inuit of Canada to the Tangu of New Guinea, From kibbuzniks in Israel to farmers in Mexico, cooperation is prized and competition generally avoided. There's this beautiful African concept of philosophy of Ubuntu. I am because we are. You know, this is so beautiful, like Ubuntu. Like, how can we tell stories around Ubuntu? So I'll move on to the excerpts from the book. Working with 7 to 9-year-olds, psychologists Spencer Kagan and Millett Madsen found that Mexican children quickly figured out how to cooperate on an experimental game, while those from the US could not. In fact, 78% of the Anglo-American children took another child's toy away for apparently no other reason than to prevent the other child from having it. Mexican children did it so only half as often. So such findings strongly suggest that competition is a matter of social training and culture rather than a built-in feature of our nature. Yeah, so like, yeah, just some excerpts from the book to back up what Douglas and Unsu just talked about. Yeah.
Okay, thanks for doing that. So you jumped ahead, did some of my homework for me already to cite all that. So basically that's the cross-cultural evidence basically that Alfie Kohn draws up. So Santosh basically jumped ahead. So luckily I don't have to go through it later. Yeah, I think it's very relevant evidence. In fact, Alfie makes the point along with this arguments about looking at anthropology, right? That if competition is really so innate, so natural, then you should see it everywhere, even among very primitive societies. But we really don't see that. And the other question he also brings up is that if it's really so spontaneous and innate, then why do we have to condition our children to love it or to thrive in it? Because you would think that if this is so ubiquitous, you don't have to do any conditioning at all. You just let people be, right? And people will be naturally competitive. So I think it's a very important point to bring up, rebuttal points. So what I just wanted to do is, just because before I get into the whole whether competition is innate thing, which really Santosh covered a little bit, I'll just say one last bit about the section we're in, this whole idea about, does competition promote character? And also you talk a bit about toxic individualism. So look, again, just drawing from my own personal experience, like I said, in the martial arts circle, right? And you find it in many other circles as well, right? There are many teachers who would eventually ask their students to join competitions. And they would, try to encourage them with a lot of lessons or mottos saying that, character is fate, martial arts is not about fighting, it's about building character. And there is, to me, in my eyes, when I see someone compete, whether they win or they lose, right? I get it. Like, there is a transformative experience that they get out of it. And some aspect of it is very positive because, when someone's competing, they start to fight a lot harder or work a lot harder. They bond closer to their peers, to their teachers, to their family, especially family members generally are very enthusiastic and supportive. But what actually really happens also after that is that it's very short-lived. And even if you don't want to look at, say, individual stories, I can offer that. But even on a societal level, when you look at China, actually, because China sends a lot of their athletes, right, their citizens to compete in the Olympics. But what happens after that is very fascinating. Actually, a lot of them generally become losers, quote unquote, in society because they have nothing left. There's a story or many stories of them selling their Olympic medals because they're too poor after they've had their height of success. And that's not one very fascinating example. Look at maybe some of the biggest celebrities that we know: Hulk Hogan, Mike Tyson. Some of these people had their heights, right? They achieve great success in life, but what happens very quickly after that is there's a great drop in terms of what goes on in their lives, their relationships with people, and we learn very toxic things about how they live their lives as well. And I think this also goes into a very big myth along with the myth of competition, which is just because someone is good at one thing doesn't mean they're very good at some other thing. So a good example near our country is Manny Pacquiao, in Philippines. So he's a great boxer, there's no doubt about that. I don't know whether he'll make a good politician though. So, that is a way that the narrative of competition deludes us or misleads us because we think that, hey, this person is very good at this one thing, it means that they're expert in everything else. So yeah, so this is really what I want to say about the whole, like, does competition really build character and, build good relationships with other people? Okay, so look, Unsu, any other comments first before I move on?
Yeah, I actually had a question that, we can address now or later, but let's say we assume, like, we're convinced by this argument that competition is neither desirable nor was it inevitable. I mean, it's not innate. It's not an innate part of our biology or culture. So I wonder, like, what are your theories about how the human race got started on this whole thing with competition in the first place? If it's not attractive and we don't benefit from it, how did it get started? What is the origin story of competition? And so I don't know if Alfie Kohn has any sort of theories or ideas about that, or he just bypasses that completely.
Oh, that's a good one. Look, it's been a while since I read the book, and like I said, the book is pretty dense, so he could have actually addressed it, but I just don't remember it right now. Neither do I have it in my notes. But yeah, one could simply, just among the three of us, right? Like, with our combined knowledge and resources, perhaps we can make an educated guess or calculation that perhaps it's due to the advent of the Industrial Revolution or agriculture or capitalism, right? Because I think societies before then, before modern societies, right? Before modern capitalism, live in a very different order and system, right? It would be a bit maybe silly to say that it wasn't competitive, because I can imagine you live in, say, a monarch or feudal society. It would be maybe a stretch to say it wasn't competitive, but maybe the emphasis isn't as strong. I think that's more likely the case. Or neither was competition promoted so vigorously as compared to now, like as if it's just life-saving, society improving formula. Perhaps people had more nuanced views about competition back then. And I think even based on my own readings and, say, history or philosophy, I mean, competition isn't really addressed as a topic for most ancient philosophers. So yeah, so I think that's a good question, and I think it could really be attributed to, like what I mentioned just now, whether it's the agriculture, industrial, or capitalist revolution.
Santosh, any ideas?
Yeah, my personal answer to this is competition has always existed, even in ancient civilizations or even indigenous communities and tribes, right? But where the distinction lies is how the energies were directed. Yeah, and so I think energies, I'm venturing a guess, in the ancient and in the indigenous, were directed towards global optimal problem solving, towards nobility, towards preserving man's balance and harmony with nature, and allowing that civilization to thrive beyond just the current generation, to leave behind something for the next generation, so that they can advance. So it was a lot, the energies were directed a lot more, we would say, in terms of noble ways for the betterment of society. Whereas what we're seeing here is competition, but the energies are directed towards extraction or destruction of, so extraction of Mother Nature, right? So you've got all of these multinational companies that use carrots and sticks. So, you've got bonuses and incentives on your key performance indicators, right? Like how much sales can we generate? How much growth can we have? Yeah, and all of those incentivize a kind of behavior that's extracting more from Mother Nature and from other human beings than actually nurturing nature. Yeah, so I think it's always existed, but it's the way in which the tool of competition was harnessed. Was it for the betterment of society as the global optima, or for local optima problem solving? Yeah, I think that's where the distinction lies.
I like how you bring up energy and how we channel it. So I recently listened to a podcast between Nate Hagens and Daniel Schmachtenberger, and Nate Hagens was talking about, actually no, I think it was Daniel Schmachtenberger who was talking about how he thinks this sort of drive for competition actually started with any kind of surplus, any kind of energy surplus. And there have been three major points in human history when humans suddenly got a spike in their ability to harness energy. So the first one was when we discovered how to make fire. The second one was when we discovered agriculture. And so like with agriculture, for the first time, you could have surplus. You could have a grain surplus and you could store it. So once humans could store that energy, they would compete, societies would compete with each other over who could store the most. Because if there was some source of cheap energy available and you didn't get it, your neighbor would. And then they would just start expanding and outgrowing you. And then the third big spike was with the discovery of fossil fuels. So yeah, I mean, I don't have the expertise to know whether that's true or not, whether this is like, but it seems like a reasonable theory.
I think one that makes sense, but also two, I wanted to also reiterate a point that actually I think Santosh made just now about artificial scarcity. And that's so important, this idea about that the scarcity is artificial. So think of like the more banal examples I gave, like, okay, who can eat their lunch the fastest? Who can rush to bed the earliest, right? So like what Alfie Kohn is pointing to is that a lot of this so-called prizes or trophies, goal attainments are artificially constructed, like as if it's important to be number one in this and that. So going back to more real issues, like more serious social level issues like food, right? Like we do know that there is abundant food. People who are starving in poor countries, it's not as if there isn't enough food around the world to feed them, but the scarcity is artificially constructed, right? So I think going back to what you say, Unsu, like when you talk about how competing societies, right, on cheap energy sources, right? So whether it's grains and stuff like that. I mean, perhaps at that time they didn't think that the scarcity was artificial. Maybe the competition is somewhat intentional, and also because it's just survival, right? But by now, with where we are right now, we don't need competition to survive in many ways. I mean, maybe some of the bigger ones, more serious ones like energy access and stuff like that, that might be a slightly more complex question for sure. But yeah, but in many ways, we don't need to compete with each other to attain at least the basic goods, I think. Okay, so I tell you what, let me just kind of finish up with the last part. Well, there's supposed to be two parts to it, but let me just say this, right? So the next question actually, we are supposed to break right now the myth of whether competition is innate. I think Santosh kind of already covered that a little bit. So I'm just going to go through some arguments that Alfie Kohn offers, because it's just, to build intellectual self-defense. So, Alfie talks about like how we do see like many different intellectuals and maybe even movements out there who try to espouse, right? Like try to say that as if competition is innate, and so we can't do away with it, or we shouldn't do anything about it because it's just part and parcel of human nature or society. But one counterpoint that Alfie has is that why don't you consider other good characteristics too? So whether it's cooperativeness, or charity, why do you always assume that the bad one is the one that's innate and everything that's positive isn't, right? And he talks about how we need to shove the burden of proof onto the other camp. One interesting point that I think he brings up is that when we talk about a question like is competition innate, I mean, it's such a theoretically complex question. How do you even begin to address it? And he thinks that it's very poor framing also, like the way that we're expected to answer a grand question like that, like as if what's the meaning of life, right? And he thinks that actually this shows how not just the sociobiologists themselves, but even the public in general, people like us, like because we're not really taught how scientific controversies are framed, debated, and interpreted. So we don't actually need to answer this question. Like we are not equipped to answer this question to begin with. So he thinks the more appropriate thing to reframe, right, this question is to ask, cui bono, who benefits from asking such a question or from making the argument that competition is innate. And so he basically, says that like usually someone making such an argument is just defending the status quo. And a good way of thinking about it is that if someone's going to argue that, racial or sexual differences are innate, what are they trying to do? Are they trying to invoke change, or are they trying to preserve the status quo? Right? Who benefits from the belief that unregulated capitalism is natural? So it's more important for us to attack that question this way. So in any case, look, he did talk a bit about like how some of these people would frame the arguments. Like he points to certain authors who would try to say, give the example of like, okay, look at us being involved in a game, right? You derive a certain pleasure from it, right? From being involved in a game. And so a researcher like that would say that, oh, that must imply that, human instinct derives pleasure from competition. But, Alfie would, rebut that and say that's like trying to argue that just because you like driving a car, then humans must have an instinctive attraction to automobile travel, which is not true. So, and then he even talks about how there are certain researchers out there who try to imply there's a competitive gene, which is not even true, So he's really warning us, like, when you look at the literature out there that is pro-competition, a lot of it is what he calls unjustified assertion, rhetorical trickery, and strawman arguments, because they really, really have not dived into the literature that he did. So, so basically we come to the real bit, which is the alternative, right? So what is the alternative? And this is the last part, basically, of my presentation, which is cooperation. And so, he talks about how really when also you look at what this, more sophisticated, more intelligent sociobiologists, right, the ones who are most prone to making arguments about competition, but there is opposing camp, and this opposing camp actually argues that cooperation is just as integral to human life, and that competition is a learned phenomenon, and that like there's one very good quote here by this author Ashley Montagu, who says that without the cooperation of its members, society cannot survive. And the society of men has survived precisely because of the cooperative of its members, and that our lives are proactively, interdependent on each other. So like I said, right, Alfie is someone who talks about school settings a lot. So he also likes to call out, like, for example, we do make people cooperate. We make our students cooperate, but we make them cooperate in competition against other groups. And, he thinks that's very cheap. Like, that's not the right way of implementing a cooperative setting or ethos. And he says when students do cooperate with each other, what we do is we call them cheating, because they're working with each other to try to get an answer to a question, and instead of trying to support them, we say that's cheating, right? So basically he's just trying to say, like, it's just this whole cultural ideas that we have that's just so warped. Yeah. So I'm just going to give you one other example of how competition is learned. So this is a very good anecdotal example that was in the book. So he talks about how there was this researcher who went to an American school, and there was a kid, Boris, who couldn't solve a maths problem. And the teacher, asked the class, who can solve it? And there were a lot of students who put up their hands. And Alfie talks about how this is a very teachable moment, right? Because what is actually happening for Boris, right, the student who couldn't answer the question, what he's learning is that for him to succeed, for the person who could answer the question, in this case is a girl called Peggy, Boris must fail, right? And that his depression is the price of her exhilaration, his misery, the occasion for her rejoicing. And he thinks this is like the standard condition of any American classroom. Going back to what actually Santosh had said just now, right? Like, it's because we indoctrinate our very young children to think this way. That's why we come up with a very hyper-competitive society. In fact, what the research shows is that very young children are generally not very competitive. In fact, very young children would wish that everyone can win, but they then learn that it's impossible, based on their experiences. And another subtle way that Alfie even talks about how this is even done, even by, say, someone as renowned as John Piaget, who is a child developmental psychologist. In one of his books, he was recorded having a conversation with a 6-year-old. And so Jean Piaget asks his child, who has won? The child answers, we've both won. And he replies, but who has won most? So all these very subtle cues and ways that we communicate with each other is all ways that we promote this competitive ideal. And there's a very big section in the book where he talks about how the family unit can be one of those sites where we do this unconsciously. And I'm going to skip past the part where Santosh talked about the cross-cultural evidence, but Santosh relied on societies that may be very different from us, right? But even take something more closer to us, like Japan. Even Japanese education is found to be less competitive than us. And maybe for some of the viewers out there, if you've seen some of those short clip videos of Japanese kids in different school systems playing games, right? You can see that culturally or socially speaking, like there's a very different behavior there, that they will be encouraging each other to win, that there may not even be any prizes given, and that the students are really there enthusiastically cheering their friends to just do something, to accomplish something. And there's no sense of like they need to compete against each other. So anyway, so just want to close this now with just a qualification. This comes directly from Alfie, right? And Santosh, you brought it up also just now, right? What are we doing as a species, as a society, as a community to address our collective problems, right? And so basically what Alfie argues is that if we are concerned about our own survival, right, the lesson really is that cooperation has far more survival value than competition. This was even recognized by Darwin, and it's quite clear, according to the research, that competition has no adaptive value whatever in the modern society. Perhaps never before in the history of man has there been so high a premium upon the adaptive value of cooperative behavior, right? So anyway, that's kind of like close to the end. I can still give some notes later, but I'd like to hear you guys share with me, your feelings about, what you make of like where we are. Like, do you think, have you seen, or have you been in, for example, instances where you've seen cooperation used as a mechanism versus competition, for example?
Santosh?
I think I'll just go back to my own personal examples. I think the people I learned from the most, and I think I model after are really my parents lah. And yeah, I think I only became a more individualistic and competitive person once I entered the school system. So I'm like deeply grateful for like the seeds that were planted before I entered primary 1, I would say. Yeah, because that's where I started to see the decline in like well-being and self-worth and all. Yeah. And I think, yeah, my parents are like extremely selfless and sacrificing individuals. And yeah, so it's I think the environment, the people who nurture us, that's like critical. It's uber critical. I mean, I'm still surprised why my my 8-year-old and 6-year-old nephews fight with each other and they compete with each other. Like, yeah, they're boys, but I'm trying to like get to the root of like their competitive spirit, right? Yeah. Whether they are inherently cooperative. I some of my doubts when I see them come over on the weekends. I mean, and I've seen culture, like the kind of education system you're in. I've seen that in like in traditional parts of India, where there's so much love and cooperation, like very little ounce of like competition. Yeah, then you've got alternative education systems like the Waldorf school by Rudolf Steiner, and the Steiner school, right? So yeah, I think there are all of these alternatives out there, and I like the example that you shared about Japan. And I've heard similar things about like in the Nordic countries, like in Finland. Yeah, so I think there are like beacons of hope outside of the Singapore mainstream education system. Yeah.
To me, these are just lenses, right? So I think if you look at the world through a competition lens, you're just going to see competition everywhere. And I think once you figure out how to flip that switch of noticing qualities of cooperation, like you start seeing it everywhere too. Like I definitely see collaboration and cooperation everywhere. I mean, I can think of so many examples. I mean, I used to play video games, first-person shooters, and like the first couple of generations of these games, it was all competitive, and then there was a certain moment when some game developer developed a game that was collaborative. You're actually working together with the other person to to achieve an objective. And the discovery was that like people enjoyed those games so much more. There was a real pleasure from being able to cooperate, right? And the Waldorf Steiner schools are such a great example. Like that whole educational approach is something that I discovered recently, and actually, visited one of these schools and learned so much more about it. It's really beautiful. Like they really build collaboration into the system, so that like when they give a math problem to some kids, like they will allow kids of different abilities and skills to work together on a problem, so that they bring different styles, different approaches, and so much so that and the whole class will move together. So like at the when they are 16 years old at the last class or whatever, like they will learn about chaos science, chaos theory in physics. All of them will learn it, like no matter what their ability, like, but it's just that someone with lower ability might, just access it or learn it at a different level. And you can see the influence that culture has. Apparently, like, you would think, okay, these kids, they kind of move together, throughout their school years, and they might form cliques. But then when a new child is introduced in, like, they embrace that child. There's this spirit of inclusion. So I think the thing that really comes to mind that I want to talk about is just nature, right? I mean, if we want to learn about collaboration, like all we have to do is look at nature. And yes, I think if you wear the lens of competition and you look at nature, you can think of it as nature, is like fighting. It's super competitive. It's like fighting tooth and nail and claw. But, more and more, like, I'm talking to farmers who are realizing that nature is actually far more collaborative than we think. So like last week, I went to visit a friend's farm in Malaysia, in Johor. It's called A Little Wild, and it's like the only farm of its kind in Southeast Asia. They're trying to implement something called syntropic farming, which is developed by this German guy, Ernst Gosch, who lives in Brazil. And it's an approach to tropical farming. And, they're going through so many examples that were just so fascinating, how, like, if you have, trees next to each other and you prune one tree, by pruning one tree, you make it shed its roots, like some of its roots die off. And then those roots then become the nutrients for the trees next to it. So if you have a tree that needs nutrients, he was saying, like, the most advanced technology cannot allow you to deliver the nutrients you need to that tree, but by pruning the tree next to it, it's like it delivers the nutrients perfectly. Like, nature has found these incredible ways to collaborate. And, I know we've talked about this before, like the mycelial network underneath the soil allows trees of different species to, like, transfer nutrients to each other. So when a tree is weak, it gets nutrients from other trees. When it becomes strong, it then can give to other trees. So, I mean, you could go on, like, with so many different examples from nature, but I think that's something we need to learn. Like, so something my friend, who is the farmer, said, nature takes care of itself. If you leave nature alone, it achieves a certain kind of harmony. It's human systems that are tricky. And so the challenge now is, how can we create human systems that are harmonious? And once we figure that out, everything else is taken care of. Nature will take care of itself. Nature will, once we live in collaboration with nature, like, we will flourish. But yeah, I mean, that's something that we have to start sort of learning. Yeah, everyone.
Yeah, great. Thanks for sharing that, because not all of us would have the experience of, like, learning, farming in such an intricate manner. So that's a really good story. So I think for me, I just want to close up with some comments. I obviously don't have that kind of experience that Onsu just had. So mine is more trivial. Is me going to watch Top Gun. So it's very funny. Top Gun is currently just really, as we speak right now, Top Gun is a really hot movie. It's soaring in the charts. It's Tom Cruise, and they're showing the American Air Force. Tom Cruise is this guy. His character is based on training really elite air fighters, right? So this is a very small spoiler in the movie. But what happens is that the team that he's tasked with are hyper competitive. They have grudges against each other. One of the characters wants to be number one. He wants to be the leader of the team. And Tom Cruise just has one scene where he gets all of them to play basic beach volleyball. Yeah. So the shot is just a couple of minutes long, and Tom Cruise just sitting down there enjoying the sun. He's watching his team play among each other. Then his superior officer comes over and says to Tom Cruise, like, what are you doing? You're wasting time. These people should be, in the jets and learning how to, go out this, learn all the things they need to learn for this very dangerous mission they're going to do. And he answers the superior officer, they're learning how to bond as a team. And then the superior asks him, what's the score? Then he answers back, there's no score. I think they stop counting. And that the point of just that one scene was to show that by Tom Cruise's character just making them cooperate with each other in a non-competitive game, he has created team bonding. And so what I like from just, and this is a very weird scene to have in a movie like this, right? But actually, I think you do see it in many stories out there. It's like what Onsu just said. If you just switch on the lens a little bit, you do notice that even in settings where we're supposed to be out for ourselves, dog eat dog world, the most important person is me and my victory. But we do find that very, innate sense of like, and this is really innate, where we want people to get along. We want people to bond as a team, right? To bond as human beings. And we need to create this kind of settings for that to happen. Incidentally, Santosh, the example you brought up about how, like when you went to school, right? That's where you felt this competitive effects. I mean, even in the literature that Alfie covers, even someone who used to live in a rural setting, when he went to work in the urban setting, he started to feel very competitive on the roads. This is apparently another one of those research findings where, you take the same individual, you just transport them to a different situation. And because of the hyper competitiveness of that place, right? And usually cities are like that. These people become very aggressive when they didn't used to be like that. So, just that switch in context and environment really, really changes things. So again, I just want to really just end off with just one last point, which is really about the fact that, yeah, like I said, based on what we've been talking about, we are inundated, indoctrinated, with all these narratives about how competition is good for us. And the very recent one was spotted in the press. So there was a local athlete, her name is Gan Ching Hui. She won 5 medals in swimming. She's got, great record in sports and athletics, and it's a very inspiring story, right? Like, I'm not saying something here to discount all of that or to downplay all of that, but when you look at such exposés, right, or such features, you also want to look at the support that these people receive. So in the case of this girl, I mean, she had great parental support. Already from a very young age, she was already learning gymnastics, golf, ballet, piano. Her father taught her squash, badminton, table tennis. So, what I want people to also take away from our discussion, right, is that even when you see someone really excellent, someone who's clearly a high achiever, don't ignore the supportive structures that this person received. Other examples in our local context is like Joseph Schooling, because he had a great father who, both parents were very supportive, obviously, of the swimming endeavors. Internationally, you've got Tiger Woods, Floyd Mayweather, all of which who are taught by very close family members to be excellent at the sport that they are good at right now. But if you take that away, I mean, they may not be at the positions they're in right now. So, that's kind of like the last thing I want people to think about, because I think even as much as we live in a competitive setting, don't ignore like all this cooperative, supportive features and structures that's so important in your life, to help you succeed and to do well. So, yeah. Okay, so that's kind of it. I just want to say, for anyone who's watched this far, please maybe watch a video by Alfie Kohn. He's an incredibly passionate speaker. We talked a bit about education just now. So like I said, he's written great books on education. I will consult with my other 2 co-hosts, maybe they want to do a session on that as well. Because one very important takeaway from what we're talking about today is that if we are against competition, then we should be against standardized testing and grades and rewards, and that's something that Alfie Kohn also brings onto the table. So yeah, all right. Any last words, guys, before we close?
No, I think I've covered a lot of what I wanted to say, and I just want to thank you for bringing this topic. It was, for us, I think it was very energizing.
No, thank you. I think it's just one thing I would like our audience to think about. If you're competing, be very observant and watchful of the game that you're playing. Like, are you playing a finite local optima game, or are you playing an infinite global optima game? Yeah, so the game that we are playing matters more than just the spirit of competition. Yeah, and I mean, it's really the nature of the game that we need to be observant about. Yeah, so I think that's about it. Yeah, but thank you. I think this is, like, for me, one of the most healing topics personally, because in my meditative practices, like in my silent retreats, I think I mentioned to you guys that, like, I've become more reclusivist. A lot of the feelings that I'm examining that I suppressed and repressed are around grudges, bitterness, that I bore with regards to individuals that were really competitive and domineering. And so, like, the appeal I would like to make to our viewers is, like, if you are competitive and you're, be very watchful of the effect you can have on another person's psyche, which can be long term. Like, it can take a long term for that person to recover. Yeah, so I don't know how much damage we are causing to people's psyche in competitive environments, but yeah, this is a very important appeal I would like to make, like, to our viewers and to just this society that we have. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, that's great. So we hope this session has been just as healing for you.
It has. Yeah, thank you.